What would you do if you discovered that the friendly neighbor who fixed your car was a serial killer? What if the retired police officer living down the street had once terrorized an entire state? Justice sometimes takes decades to arrive, and the monsters among us may wear the most convincing disguises. Welcome to Crime Representer, where we examine the darkest chapters of criminal history to understand the psychological, forensic, and social dimensions of these cases. Today, we're exploring 3 chilling stories of serial killers who evaded capture for decades before finally facing justice, cases that revolutionized forensic science and changed how we think about cold case investigations forever. November 10, 1985. The forest floor of Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire was blanketed with frost and fallen leaves. The crisp autumn air carried the sounds of wildlife and the occasional hunter moving through the underbrush. One such hunter, experienced woodsman Gary Mathias, ventured deeper into the park than usual that day, drawn to an area less frequented by others. What caught his attention changed the course of New Hampshire criminal history. A rusted 55-gallon metal drum lying on its side, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, perhaps merely discarded trash, but something about it prompted Mathias to investigate further. The acrid smell that greeted him as he approached the barrel would haunt him for years to come. Inside lay the decomposed remains of 2 bodies, a woman estimated to be between 33 years old and a young girl between 8. Both were wrapped in plastic, their bodies reduced to skeletal remains after years of exposure to the elements within their metal coffin. Initial forensic analysis estimated the time of death between 1977 and 1985, giving investigators a broad window to work with. The bodies bore signs of blunt force trauma, indicating a violent end. Yet the most disturbing aspect was what they didn't find. No identification, no personal effects, nothing that might give these victims names. This was absolutely unusual for New Hampshire, reflected Lieutenant Michael Kokoski, who would later work the case. 2 victims, both murdered by blunt force trauma, disposed of in this manner. It wasn't something we'd seen before. The Allenstown Police Department, assisted by the New Hampshire State Police Major Crime Unit, combed the area meticulously. They searched for additional evidence, anything that might provide a starting point for the investigation. But the forest held its secrets close. The mid-1980s marked the very beginning of modern forensic science. DNA profiling had been developed just a year earlier in 1984 by British geneticist Alec Jeffreys, but was not yet widely available for criminal investigation. Investigators relied on more traditional methods. Fingerprints, none were found. Dental records, which required knowing who to compare them to, and witness statements in a remote area where no witnesses came forward. Without identities for the victims, investigators couldn't connect them to missing persons reports. Were they local? Had they been reported missing at all? These fundamental questions remained unanswered as months turned into years. The community of Allenstown, with a population of only about 4,300, was deeply affected by the murders. Local newspapers ran features on the case, asking anyone with information to come forward. Community meetings were held to address safety concerns. But as time passed, the case gradually receded from public consciousness, becoming a dark footnote in local history. As the investigation stalled, the unidentified victims were laid to rest in St. John the Baptist Cemetery. A donated headstone marked their grave with the poignant inscription, "Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 22-33 and a girl child age 8. Their slain bodies were found on November 10, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care. The case files remained open but inactive, gathering dust as investigators turned their attention to more recent crimes with more promising leads. A detective's persistence and a second discovery. Detective John Cody joined the New Hampshire State Police years after the Bear Brook murders, but found himself drawn to the unsolved case. Something about it nagged at him: the brutality, the disposal method, the lack of identity for the victim. Most of all, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to find. In May 2000, nearly 15 years after the initial discovery, Cody decided to revisit the scene. Bear Brook State Park remained largely unchanged, still dense with pine and oak trees, still isolated in many areas. Cody retraced the investigation, reviewing photographs of the original scene and walking the same paths. His persistence paid off in a way that would send shockwaves through the investigative team. Just 300 feet from where the first barrel had been discovered, Cody found a second barrel. Like the first, it contained human remains, this time of 2 more young girls, one estimated to be 2. Finding that second barrel so close to the first one was both validating and frustrating. Cody would later explain, "Validating because my instincts were right. There was more to find. Frustrating because it had been there all along, just a short walk from the original crime scene." This discovery transformed the case from a double homicide to a confirmed serial killing. How had the second barrel been missed in the original investigation? The area had been searched, but the dense underbrush and the barrel's weathered appearance, blending into the forest environment, had concealed it from investigators. The forensic analysis suggested that all 4 victims had been killed around the same time period. This wasn't 2 separate incidents years apart. This was the work of a single killer who had disposed of his victims in 2 separate containers, but in the same general location. The breakthrough forensic genealogy enters the scene. For years, the investigation continued to yield few results. DNA profiles were developed for all 4 victims, confirming that 3 of them were maternally related, likely a mother and 2 daughters. The 4th victim, the middle child in terms of age, was not biologically related to the others, but was killed and disposed of with them. The real breakthrough wouldn't come until 2016-2017, when forensic genealogy, the combination of genetic analysis with traditional genealogical methods, emerged as a powerful new tool in criminal investigations. Barbara Ray Venter, a genetic genealogist who would later gain fame for her work on the Golden State Killer case, was brought in to apply these new techniques to the Bear Brook murder. The process involved uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases, like GEDmatch, searching for distant relatives of the victim. Through painstaking work building family trees and narrowing down possibilities, researchers finally identified the adult victim as Merlise Elizabeth Honeychurch, and 2 of the children as her daughters, Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWater. The 4th victim, the middle child, was determined to be the biological daughter of the killer himself, a shocking discovery that provided a direct genetic link to the perpetrator. It was a moment of both triumph and heartbreak, recalled Dr. Ray Venter. These victims had names again after more than 30 years, but learning that one victim was the killer's own daughter, that was particularly disturbing. The shadow man, Terry Rasmussen. As investigators worked to identify the victims, they also began closing in on the killer through a complex web of aliases and crimes spanning decades. Terry Rasmussen was born in 1943 in Denver, Colorado. After serving in the U.S. Navy from 1961 to 1967, he married and had 4 children. But by the mid-1970s, Rasmussen had abandoned his family and begun a nomadic existence, characterized by multiple identities and a trail of missing women. Rasmussen's movements and activities during the late 1970s reveal a pattern of forming relationships with vulnerable women, often single mothers, before they mysteriously disappeared. In November 1978, Merlise Honeychurch and her 2 daughters vanished after visiting family for Thanksgiving in La Puente, California. Witnesses later confirmed she had been dating a man who matched Rasmussen's description, then using the name Bob Evans. Between 1979 and 1981, Rasmussen worked at the Wambeck Mill in Manchester, New Hampshire, just 20 miles from where the bodies would later be found. He used another alias, Bob Evans, and lived with another woman, Denise Baudin, and her infant daughter. After Thanksgiving 1981, Baudin and Rasmussen disappeared with her daughter. Baudin's family, believing they had left due to financial troubles, never filed a missing persons report. Baudin has never been found and is presumed to be another of Rasmussen's victims. Rasmussen, still using the Evans alias, surfaced in California in 1985 with Baudin's daughter, whom he called Lisa. In 1986, he abandoned the child at a campground in Scotts Valley, California, telling neighbors he couldn't care for her anymore. When arrested for child abandonment in 1985, he was using the name Curtis Mo Kimball. After serving a short sentence, Rasmussen disappeared again, this time re-emerging as Larry Vanner in California in the early 1990s. He married Yoon Soon Jun in 2001,
who disappeared the following year. Her body was found buried under cat litter in their basement in This murder would finally end Rasmussen's decades-long killing spree. Convicted of June's murder in 2003, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. He died in prison in 2010 of natural causes, never having been charged with the Bear Brook murders or questioned about the numerous women who disappeared during his cross-country travels.
The case took another remarkable turn through the story of the abandoned child, Lisa. In 2003, after Rasmussen's arrest for June's murder, California authorities attempted to determine Lisa's true identity. DNA testing revealed she was not Rasmussen's biological daughter, raising questions about her origins. It wasn't until 2016 that DNA and genetic genealogy identified Lisa as Dawn Bowden, the daughter of Denise Bowden, who had disappeared with Rasmussen in Through further investigation, researchers made the connection between Rasmussen and the Bear Brook murders. A crucial piece of evidence came when DNA testing revealed that the unidentified toddler in the second barrel was Rasmussen's biological daughter. This genetic link conclusively tied Rasmussen to the Bear Brook murders and established a timeline. He must have fathered a child with an unknown woman, murdered that woman along with the child, Marlise Honeychurch, and her 2 daughters, and disposed of all 4 bodies in the barrel. The complexity of this case is unlike anything I've seen in my career, stated Senior Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strelzin. One individual using multiple names, operating in multiple states, with victims who weren't even reported missing. It's a case that demonstrates how killers could exploit system limitations before modern forensics and communication. The identification of Rasmussen as the Bear Brook Killer answered many questions, but raised others. Who was the mother of Rasmussen's daughter found in the barrel? How many other victims might there be across the country? Investigators believe there could be additional victims in New Hampshire, California, and other states where Rasmussen lived. Denise Bowden remains missing and presumed murdered. Investigations continue into Rasmussen's movements between 1978 and 1984, with particular focus on identifying women who might have been in relationships with him during this period. The case transformed how investigators approach cold cases, highlighting the power of persistence and new technologies. It demonstrated how a killer could exploit the limitations of law enforcement communication and record-keeping across different states and jurisdictions. Most importantly, the Bear Brook case provided closure for the families of Marlise Honeychurch and their daughters, who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their loved ones. The identification of the victims allowed them to be properly buried and remembered by their true names, not just as anonymous victims. The Bear Brook murders case represents one of the most significant applications of forensic genealogy in solving cold cases. The techniques pioneered in this investigation have since been applied to hundreds of other unsolved cases across the country. The case also highlighted serious gaps in missing persons protocols. Marlise Honeychurch and her daughters were never officially reported missing, as family members believed they had simply chosen to cut contact. Similarly, Denise Bowden's family never filed a missing persons report. These gaps allowed Rasmussen to operate undetected for years. In response, many jurisdictions have revised their policies regarding missing persons reports, no longer requiring specific waiting periods or family relationships to file report. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, NEMIS, was created in part due to cases like this one, providing a centralized database that crosses jurisdictional boundaries. The Bear Brook case remains open as investigators continue to search for additional victims and fill in the gaps of Rasmussen's movement. But the identification of both the killer and his victims represents a remarkable achievement in cold case investigation, one that brought a measure of justice after more than 3 decades of silence. Our story begins in the small agricultural community of Visalia, California, in the early 1970s. Between April 1974 and December 1975, residents experienced a bizarre crime spree involving more than 100 burglaries committed by someone the local press dubbed the Visalia Ransacker. Unlike typical burglars who target valuable items, the ransacker displayed disturbing behavioral patterns. He would break into homes, often when no one was present, and rather than stealing obvious valuables like electronics or jewelry, he would take personal items with sentimental value, single earrings from pairs, wedding rings, family photographs, and peculiarly women's underwear. What made these burglaries stand out was the psychological component. explained retired Visalia police detective William McGowan. This wasn't about financial gain. The perpetrator would ransack bedrooms, scatter underwear around, and sometimes arrange personal items in unsettling displays. He was getting some kind of psychological satisfaction from violating these homes. The ransacker had specific methodologies. He would often disable exterior lights, remove window screens, and pile dishes or pots and pans near doors to create noise traps if homeowners return. He frequently urinated or defecated in the homes, a behavior criminologists associate with extreme contempt for victims and territorial marking. The crime spree escalated on September 11, 1975, when College of the Sequoias journalism professor Claude Snelling was murdered while protecting his teenage daughter from being kidnapped by an intruder in their home. The would-be abductor, believed to be the ransacker, fled after shooting Snelling. 2 months later, on December 10, 1975, Detective McGowan nearly captured the ransacker during a stakeout, but was temporarily blinded when the suspect fired a shot that shattered his flashlight. After this close call, the Visalia ransacker's activities suddenly ceased in the area. Approximately 200 miles northwest of Visalia, the bedroom communities of Sacramento County were about to face a new nightmare. Beginning in June 1976, a masked intruder began attacking women in their homes in the eastern areas of Sacramento, earning him the moniker East Area Rapist. His first documented attack occurred on June 18, 1976, when a woman in Rancho Cordova was awakened by a masked man standing over her bed, holding a knife. The intruder bound her hands with shoelaces, stole several items, and sexually assaulted her. This would become his signature method of operation. Careful planning, pre-surveillance of targets, entering homes through unlocked windows or sliding doors, binding victims with materials he brought or found in the home, and threatening to kill them if they made noise. By summer 1977, the ER had attacked over a dozen women, creating widespread fear throughout Sacramento County. Sheriff's Detective Carol Daly began conducting community safety meetings. Unaware that the perpetrator himself sometimes attended these meetings to gauge public reaction and police knowledge. The level of fear in the community was unlike anything I've ever seen, Daly would later recall. People were buying guns, installing security systems, getting guard dogs. Neighborhoods formed watch groups. Men would take turns patrolling streets at night. The ER's methodology became more sophisticated and sinister over time. He began targeting couples, forcing the male partner to lie face down with plates stacked on his back. He would tell the man that if he heard the plates fall, he would kill everyone in the house. This allowed him to control multiple victims while assaulting the female partner. Perhaps most disturbing was his habit of calling victims before or after attacks. Sometimes he would call homes beforehand to confirm if residents were present. In other cases, he would call survivors months or even years later, breathing into the phone or whispering threats like, "Remember when we played?" These calls demonstrated both his continued psychological hold over victims and his meticulous record-keeping of their information. By 1978, the ER had committed at least 50 attacks across multiple Sacramento area communities, including Rancho Cordova, Citrus Heights, Sacramento, Carmichael, and Orangevale. The magnitude of his crimes prompted one of the largest manhunts in California history, with hundreds of officers working the case. In October 1979, the East Area Rapist's attacks in Northern California suddenly stopped. Law enforcement thought perhaps he had been imprisoned for another crime, had moved away, or had simply stopped offending. What they didn't realize was that he had merely shifted his hunting grounds southward and escalated his violence. On October 1, 1979, Dr. Robert Offerman and Dr. Deborah Manning were found murdered in Offerman's condominium near Goleta, Santa Barbara County. They had been bound, but the bindings on Offerman were found broken, suggesting he had tried to fight back, before both were shot multiple times. This double homicide marked the beginning of what would later be called the original Night Stalker phase, to distinguish from Richard Ramirez, who would later be dubbed the Night Stalker. Investigators didn't connect these murders to the East Area Rapist at the time, treating them as an isolated incident. On March 13, 1980, Charlene and Lyman Smith were found bludgeoned to death in their Ventura home. Charlene had been sexually assaulted, and both victims were bound with drapery cord. The killer had used a log from their fireplace as the murder weapon.
4 more couples would be killed in similar fashion over the next 6 years. Keith and Patrice Harrington in Dana Point, Orange County, August 1980. Manuela Withune in Irvine, Orange County, February 1981. Her husband was hospitalized at the time of the attack. Churi Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta, Santa Barbara County, July 1981. Janelle Cruz in Irvine, Orange County, May 1986. Each crime scene showed similar characteristics: precise methods of entry, binding of victims, sexual assault of female victims, and extreme violence, typically bludgeoning with an object found at the scene. After the murder of Janelle Cruz in 1986, the killings stopped. For the next 2 decades, the cases would remain unsolved, with investigators in different jurisdictions unaware they were hunting the same predator.
The first crucial connection between the Northern and Southern California crimes came in 2001. DNA technology had advanced significantly since the original investigations, allowing for more sophisticated analysis of crime scene evidence. Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department submitted DNA evidence from East Area rapist crime scenes for analysis. Independently, investigators in Southern California did the same with evidence from the original Night Stalker murders. When these profiles were compared through the combined DNA index system, TODIS, they matched, confirming that the East Area rapist and original Night Stalker were the same individual. This revelation was staggering. It meant that one perpetrator was responsible for at least 50 sexual assaults in Northern California and at least 10 murders across the state. The media began referring to this unknown offender as the Ear Owens East Area Rapist Original Night Stalker, or later as the Golden State Killer, a term coined by late crime writer Michelle McNamara. Finding out these cases were connected was like discovering we had a serial offender on a scale rarely seen in criminal history, said Larry Poole, an Orange County cold case investigator who worked on the Southern California murders. We're talking about someone who terrorized multiple communities across hundreds of miles for over a decade. Despite having the perpetrator's DNA profile, investigators still couldn't identify him. His DNA didn't match any samples in criminal databases, suggesting he had never been convicted of a crime requiring DNA collection, or at least not since such collection became standard practice. The case remained frustratingly cold until April 2018, when investigators employed a novel investigative technique, forensic genetic genealogy. This approach involves uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, where users voluntarily share their genetic information, usually to research family history. Rather than looking for the perpetrator directly, investigators search for distant relatives, third or fourth cousins who share enough DNA with the unknown subject to create a connection. From those matches, genealogists built extensive family trees, working backward to common ancestors and then forward to identify potential suspects. This technique had been pioneered in the Bear Brook murders case and was becoming increasingly refined. The Golden State Killer investigation team, led by Paul Holes and including genealogist Barbara Ray Venter, uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch and began the painstaking process of building family trees from distant matches. After months of work narrowing down possibilities, investigators zeroed in on a shocking suspect, Joseph James DeAngelo, a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb where some of the original East Area rapist attacks had occurred. DeAngelo had served as a police officer in Exeter near Visalia from 1973 to 1976, precisely during the Visalia ransacker period. He then worked for the Auburn Police Department from 1976 to 1979, coinciding exactly with the East Area rapist crime. He was fired in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent. Around the same time, the crimes shifted to Southern California. To confirm their suspicions, investigators conducted surveillance on DeAngelo, collecting discarded DNA samples from items he had thrown away. These samples matched the crime scene DNA, providing probable cause for arrest. On April 24, 2018, law enforcement arrested Joseph James DeAngelo outside his Citrus Heights home. The man who had terrorized California for over a decade, who had eluded capture for more than 40 years, was finally in custody. The arrest shocked those who knew DeAngelo, including his ex-wife, daughters, and neighbor. To them, he was a retired grandfather who could be cantankerous and was known for outbursts of anger, but certainly not someone they suspected of being one of America's most notorious serial predators.
"He was hiding in plain sight," said Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. "He was living in this neighborhood, living a normal life with a family." DeAngelo's law enforcement background provided insight into how he had managed to evade capture for so long. As a police officer, he understood investigation techniques, knew how to avoid leaving evidence, and recognized the limitations of law enforcement communication across jurisdictions. He used his knowledge of police procedures to his advantage, explained Paul Holes, the retired investigator who had pursued the case for decades. He knew about evidence collection, about jurisdictional issues. He targeted areas near highways or boundaries between police jurisdictions, making coordination of investigations more difficult. The scope of the crimes, a reign of terror quantified, as investigators dug deeper into DeAngelo's past and compared notes across jurisdictions. The full scope of his crimes became apparent. The official counts attributed to the Golden State Killer include at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, over 120 residential burglaries, crimes spanning at least 11 different California jurisdictions. Many investigators believe these numbers represent only the confirmed cases and that the actual totals may be significantly higher. Numerous unsolved sexual assaults and murders from the period share similarities with DeAngelo's known crimes, but lack definitive evidence linking him to them. "We may never know the full extent of his crimes," said retired Detective Carol Daly. "There are likely victims who never reported assaults, especially given the stigma around sexual crimes and there may be murder victims whose cases weren't connected because the methods varied or evidence was limited. Due to the complexity of the case involving multiple jurisdictions and the advanced age of both the defendant and many witnesses, prosecutors from the various counties agreed to consolidate the charges. DeAngelo would face trial in Sacramento County but with input from all affected jurisdictions. On June 29, 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 kidnapping-related charges. He also admitted to numerous uncharged crimes, including dozens of rapes that could not be prosecuted due to statute of limitations. The plea agreement spared DeAngelo the death penalty but ensured he would spend the remainder of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. More importantly, it spared survivors the trauma of a lengthy trial while still providing them an opportunity to confront him in court. In August 2020, over 3 days of impact statements, survivors and family members of murder victims addressed DeAngelo directly. Their statements revealed the lasting trauma his crimes had inflicted, decades of fear, broken relationships, persistent nightmares, and lives forever altered. One survivor, Jane Carson Sandler, attacked in 1976, told DeAngelo, "You no longer have power over me. I've lived with the consequences of your actions for 42 years. Now it's your turn." Throughout the proceedings, DeAngelo sat motionless, showing no visible reaction to the emotional testimony. When finally given an opportunity to speak, he offered a brief statement. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." On August 20, 2020, Sacramento County Superior Court Judge Michael Bowman sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional life term and 8 years for weapons charges. When a person commits monstrous acts, they need to be locked away so they can never harm an innocent person, Judge Bowman declared during sentencing. The psychological profile. What made the Golden State Killer? Joseph DeAngelo's crimes and background provide criminologists and psychologists with valuable insights into the development and behavior of organized serial offenders. Born in 1945 in Bath, New York, DeAngelo's early life included potential risk factors identified in many serial offenders. His father was absent during much of his childhood, and he witnessed his sister being raped by 2 airmen when he was a child, according to some family accounts. He served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, then returned to earn a degree in criminal justice. His law enforcement career gave him both authority and insight into investigation techniques, while his criminology education may have helped him understand how to avoid detection. DeAngelo's crimes showed evidence of both planning and evolution. He began with voyeurism and burglary, gradually escalating to sexual assault and ultimately murder. This progression aligns with criminological theories about how fantasy-driven offenders often escalate over time as they require increasingly extreme experiences to fulfill their psychological need. His methodology evolved as well. Early East Area rapist attacks targeted women alone, but he later shifted to couples, introducing the additional control element of forcing a man to listen to the assault of his partner. This suggests a need for increasing power and domination over time. The Golden State Killer represents a textbook case of an organized offender, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Ann Burgess. He carefully selected victims, conducted surveillance, brought tools and bindings, disabled phones, and had escape routes planned. These aren't impulsive crimes, they're meticulously orchestrated performances fueled by fantasy. Perhaps most disturbing was DeAngelo's ability to compartmentalize. During the same period he was committing rapes as the East Area Rapist, he was also working as a police officer, ostensibly protecting the public. He later married, had 3 daughters, and maintained long-term employment, presenting a normal facade that hid his predatory nature. Legacy and impact: how the Golden State Killer case changed criminal justice. The Golden State Killer case has had profound impacts on criminal justice, forensic science, and public policy. Forensic genealogy revolution. The use of genetic genealogy to identify DeAngelo transformed cold case investigation. Since his arrest, this technique has been used to solve hundreds of previously unsolvable cases across the country. Legislative changes. The use of genealogy databases in criminal investigations raised privacy concerns, leading several states to enact legislation regulating this practice. Simultaneously, California eliminated the statute of limitations for rape cases, partly in response to the inability to prosecute DeAngelo for dozens of sexual assaults. Cold case reinvestigation. The high-profile success of the Golden State Killer case inspired law enforcement agencies nationwide to re-examine cold cases with preserved DNA evidence. Many departments have created or expanded cold case units as a result. Improved interjurisdictional cooperation. The case highlighted the dangers of fragmented investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. Many states have since implemented better systems for sharing information about similar crimes across different agencies. Victim advocacy. Survivors of the Golden State Killer formed support networks and became powerful advocates for victims' rights and cold case investigation funding. Their testimony before state legislatures has helped secure resources for testing backlogged rape kits and investigating unsolved sexual assault. The Golden State Killer case stands as a landmark in the evolution of criminal investigation, demonstrating both how predators exploited system limitations in the past and how modern technology can finally bring them to justice, even decades later. It offers hope to victims of unsolved crimes that answers may still come, regardless of how much time has passed.
As crack cocaine ravaged south-central Los Angeles in the mid-1980s, creating a storm of violence and desperation, a predator emerged who would exploit the chaos to hide his crimes. For over 2 decades, he stalked the streets, targeting vulnerable women while living openly as a trusted member of the community. The story of the Grim Sleeper is not just about a serial killer, it's about systemic failures, societal indifference, and the persistence required to bring justice to victims society had largely forgotten. Los Angeles in the 1980s was experiencing an unprecedented crime wave fueled by the crack epidemic. Homicide rates soared, particularly in South Central, where economic devastation, gang violence, and drug addiction created perfect conditions for predators to operate undetected. On August 10, 1985, 29-year-old Deborah Jackson, a cocktail waitress, was walking home from work when she encountered a man who offered her a ride. Her body was found the next day in an alley, wrapped in a carpet and discarded like trash. She had been shot 3 times in the chest with a .25 caliber handgun. At the time, Jackson's murder was just one more statistic in a city experiencing hundreds of homicides annually. Detective Rick Jackson of the LAPD recalled, "In those days, we were getting 5-6 murders a night. It was overwhelming. We were constantly triaging cases. Over the next 3 years, 7 more women would be murdered in similar fashion. Henrietta Wright, 35, August 1986. Barbara Ware, 23, January 1987. Bernita Sparks, 26, April 1987. Mary Lowe, 26, November 1987. LaCreca Jefferson, 22, January 1988. Alicia Alexander, 18, September 1988. All were found in alleyways or dumpsters, most wrapped in carpet, trash bags, or blankets. All had been shot with the same small caliber weapon. Most had evidence of sexual assault before death. These murders shared distinctive characteristics that differentiated them from the typical gang or drug-related killings plaguing the area. The victims were positioned in particular ways, suggesting The killer took time with the bodies, often posing them, and several victims were found with cloth or plastic materials covering their faces. Another signature element. By 1988, LAPD detectives had begun to recognize the pattern. Detective Pam Bauman, assigned to several of the cases, noticed the similarities and pushed for the creation of a task force to investigate what was clearly becoming a serial murder case. The positioning of the bodies, the caliber of weapon, the targeting of women in the same geographic area. These weren't coincidences, Bauman explained in a later interview. This was clearly one individual with a specific method. The LAPD formed a task force codenamed Southside Slayer, investigating not only these cases, but other potentially related murders in South Los Angeles. They collected physical evidence, interviewed witnesses, and created a profile of a suspect who likely lived in the area, knew the streets well, and had access to a vehicle. Crucially, investigators managed to recover DNA evidence from several victims, although DNA technology was still in its infancy and not yet the powerful tool it would later become. This biological evidence would prove vital decades later. Then something unexpected happened. After the murder of Alicia Alexander in September 1988, the killings that matched this specific pattern suddenly stopped. Had the killer been arrested for another crime? Had he died, moved away, or was he just lying dormant? As months stretched into years with no new cases matching the pattern, the investigation gradually lost momentum. Resources were diverted to more recent cases, and the task force was eventually disbanded. The case files grew cold, though they were never formally closed. For 13 years, from 1988 to 2002, the killer, who would later be dubbed the Grim Sleeper, appeared to cease his murderous activity. This unusual extended break between killing sprees, which ultimately gave him his nickname, puzzled investigators and created a false sense that the threat had passed. During this period, South Central Los Angeles continued to struggle with high crime rates, poverty, and institutional neglect. Many of the earlier victims' cases gathered dust as detectives moved on to new assignments or retired. The families of the victims, however, never forgot. They formed support groups, held memorial services, and continually pressed police for updates. Margaret Prescott, a community activist, founded the Black Coalition fighting back serial murders in 1986 after recognizing the pattern of killings targeting Black women. For years, her organization accused the LAPD of applying fewer resources to these cases than they would have if the victims had been from more affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods. If the first victim had been found in Beverly Hills, there would have been a different response. Prescott noted in her testimony to the police commission years later. These women's lives mattered. They had families who loved them, but the system treated them as disposable. On March 9, 2002, the silence was shattered when the body of 14-year-old Princess Berthomew was discovered in an alley in Inglewood. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted, breaking the pattern of gunshot wounds seen in the earlier victim. Due to this difference in methodology, investigators didn't immediately connect her murder to the previous series. The killer struck again in July 2003, claiming the life of Valerie McCorvey, 35, and then in January 2000. Both women had been sexually assaulted, and Peters was shot with a .25 caliber handgun, the same caliber used in the 1980s murders. By this time, DNA technology had advanced significantly. When crime lab technicians analyzed evidence from Peters' murder, they found that the DNA matched samples from multiple victims from the 1980s series. This crucial discovery confirmed what some detectives had suspected: the Southside Slayer had returned. In 2008, then Police Chief William Bratton authorized a new task force dedicated to solving these connected murders. Detective Dennis Kilcoyne led the effort, which employed innovative investigative techniques to track a killer who had eluded justice for decades. The breakthrough came through a technique called familial DNA searching. Traditional DNA database searches look for exact matches between crime scene evidence and profiles in the database. Familial searching looks instead for partial matches that might indicate a close relative of the perpetrator. In 2010, after a conventional search of California's felon database yielded no matches, authorities ran a familial DNA search. They got a hit, not with the killer,
but with someone in the database who shared enough genetic markers to potentially be a close relative. That individual was Christopher Franklin, a young man with a felony weapons conviction. His DNA indicated he might be related to the killer they saw. Investigators constructed a family tree for Franklin and zeroed in on his father, Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a 57-year-old mechanic living right in the heart of South Central Los Angeles. To confirm their suspicions, detectives orchestrated an elaborate operation. They placed Franklin under surveillance and followed him to a pizza restaurant in Buena Park. An undercover officer posed as a busboy and collected Franklin's half-eaten pizza crust, a napkin, and a glass he had used. The DNA from these items provided a conclusive match to the crime scene evidence. On July 7, 2010, police arrested Lonnie David Franklin Jr. at his home on West 81st Street, a residence located in the geographic center of his killing fields. The hidden trophy room, uncovering the true scope. What investigators discovered inside Franklin's house was even more disturbing than they had anticipated. Hidden behind false walls and in crawl spaces were hundreds of photographs and video recordings of women, many in compromising or vulnerable positions. Some women in the photos appeared unconscious or possibly deceased. Others were clearly being sexually assaulted while incapacitated. Franklin had meticulously documented his crimes, creating a macabre trophy collection that suggested the official victim count of 10 might represent only a fraction of his actual victims. Detective Kilcoyne described the discovery. It was like opening a time capsule of horror. There were hundreds of women, from teenagers to older adults, all photographed in various states of undress or vulnerability. Many appeared to be under the influence of something or unconscious. Police released 180 photos of unidentified women to the public, hoping to determine if they were still alive. Eventually, most were identified and found to be living, though many had no recollection of interactions with Franklin or of being photographed, suggesting he may have drugged them before taking the photos. However, approximately 30 women from the photographs remain unidentified to this day. Investigators fear some may represent additional victims whose bodies were never found or whose deaths were attributed to drug overdoses or other causes.
Franklin, known to neighbors as LD, lived a seemingly normal life in plain sight. He worked as a garbage collector for the city of Los Angeles from 1981 to 1989, which gave him intimate knowledge of alleyways and secluded areas throughout South Central. Later, he worked as a mechanic, operating an informal repair shop in his garage. Neighbors described him as friendly and helpful, a family man who would fix cars at discount prices and was always ready to assist with household repairs. He was married with 2 children and was active in the community, attending neighborhood events and local church services. He was the neighborhood mechanic, recalled neighbor Donna Harris. Everybody went to him to get their cars fixed. He seemed like such a normal guy, would barbecue, wave hello, talk about sports. No one could have imagined what he was doing. Franklin's wife of 32 years and his son claimed to have no knowledge of his crimes. They described him as a strict but loving family man who maintained a regular work schedule and showed no unusual behaviors at home. What made Franklin's double life even more chilling was his geographical stability. He committed his crimes within a relatively small radius of his home, sometimes just blocks away from where he lived with his family. Several victims were found on streets he would have traveled daily. Some investigators believe Franklin's work as a garage attendant at the LAPD's 77th Street station in the early 1980s may have given him insight into police procedures and investigation techniques, helping him evade capture for so long. Franklin's trial began in February 2016, nearly 6 years after his arrest. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA matches from multiple crime scenes, ballistic evidence linking the murders to a .25 caliber pistol found in Franklin's home, and testimony from a survivor who had escaped after being attacked in 1988. Ineatra Washington provided crucial testimony as the only known survivor of Franklin's attacks. In November 1988, she accepted a ride from a man she later identified as Franklin. He shot her in the chest, sexually assaulted her as she was losing consciousness, and took a Polaroid photograph of her before pushing her out of his car. That photograph was later found in Franklin's collection. "I'm looking death in the face," Washington testified, describing the moment she realized her attacker intended to kill her. Her testimony provided jurors with the only first-hand account of Franklin's methodology and helped establish the link between the 1980s series and the later murder. On May 5, 2016, after deliberating for just over a day, the jury found Franklin guilty of 10 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On June 6, 2016, the same jury recommended the death penalty. On August 10, 2016, exactly 31 years to the day after his first known victim, Deborah Jackson, was found, Judge Kathleen Kennedy sentenced Franklin to death. In delivering the sentence, she described his crimes as monstrous and noted that his actions had cost families immeasurable pain. Franklin maintained his innocence throughout the trial and declined to speak at his sentencing. He never provided any explanation for his crimes or the long hiatus between killing sprees that earned him the moniker Grim Sleep. Legacy, Lessons Learned and Lives Remembered. On March 28, 2020, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. was found unresponsive in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead of unknown causes, having spent less than 4 years on death row. Many victims' families expressed frustration that he escaped full accountability through his relatively peaceful death. The Grim Sleeper case left a profound impact on Los Angeles and on policing practices nationwide, improved attention to marginalized communities. The case highlighted disparities in how crimes against vulnerable populations were investigated. The LAPD has since implemented protocols to ensure equal resource allocation regardless of where crimes occur or who the victims are. Advancement of familial DNA testing. The successful use of familial DNA in this high-profile case accelerated acceptance of this technique, which has since helped solve numerous cold cases across the country. Cold case units. The LAPD expanded its cold case division and implemented better evidence preservation protocols, ensuring that DNA and other biological evidence from unsolved crimes remains viable for future testing as technology advances. Community activism. The Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders demonstrated how persistent community advocacy can keep cases alive even when official investigations stall. Their work has inspired similar groups in other cities. Recognition of victims. The case brought long overdue attention to the lives of the victims, who were more than just statistics or the pejorative labels often assigned to them in earlier reporting. Memorial services and community remembrances have helped preserve their memory. Perhaps the most important legacy is the acknowledgement that every victim deserves the full force of justice, regardless of their circumstances or the neighborhoods in which they live. As Detective Kilcoyne reflected after the trial, these women were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. They had dreams and aspirations. Their lives mattered, and it took far too long for our system to demonstrate that to their families. Conclusion: the changing landscape of cold case investigation. The cases of Terry Rasmussen, Joseph DeAngelo, and Lonnie Franklin Jr. represent more than just the capture of 3 prolific serial killers. They illustrate the evolution of criminal investigation techniques, the importance of persistence, and the power of technological innovation in the pursuit of justice. Each case demonstrates how predators exploited specific vulnerabilities in the criminal justice system of their eras. Rasmussen capitalized on the lack of communication between jurisdictions and the absence of centralized missing persons database, allowing him to move across state lines with victims and assume new identities with impunity. DeAngelo utilized his knowledge as a police officer to anticipate investigative techniques and deliberately cross jurisdictional boundaries to complicate investigation. He also exploited the primitive state of forensic science in the Franklin benefited from societal indifference toward crimes occurring in marginalized communities and the overwhelming volume of violent crime during the crack epidemic, which allowed his murders to blend into background statistics. What ultimately brought these killers to justice was a combination of technological advancement, investigative persistence, and a growing societal commitment to resolving cold cases. The development of forensic genealogy in particular has revolutionized cold case investigation, offering hope to families who have waited decades for answers. As we look to the future, these cases remind us of the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining cold case units despite budget pressures, and ensuring that all victims, regardless of race, class, or life circumstances, receive equal dedication from the justice system. They also serve as powerful reminders that justice, while sometimes delayed, need never be denied. For the families of victims, these resolutions, even decades later, provide a measure of closure that had long seemed impossible. And for society as a whole, they offer reassurance that even the most careful predators cannot escape accountability forever. The monsters may walk among us, wearing convincing disguises of normality,
But science, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to justice continue to strip away those facades, one cold case at a time.